Well, good afternoon, everyone. Everyone can hear me okay in the room? Great. I have a tendency to yell into these things, so just start throwing things at me if I'm too loud. And I'd also like to welcome the people on live streaming at home and in offices and rooms across the state. I'm Dan Shaw. I'm one of the co-chairs of the New South Wales Innovation Network and also the Innovation Manager for South East Sydney Local Health District. My colleague Gianni is the other co-chair of the New South Wales Innovation Network and is the Innovation Manager at Northern Sydney LHD. So we'd like to welcome you all here today. Before we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging traditional owners of the land, Aboriginal people, past, present, elders, and welcome any of our Aboriginal colleagues with us here today. So a little bit of housekeeping, as with any event. The bathrooms are located just out this door to my left, around past the registration desk and down the hall. We ask that those in the room, if you could just keep your phones on silent. We understand that everyone needs to take calls, so you can exit at the front here on my left, or there's a door up the back there if you need to take a call. So we have over 130 people registered today to attend this session via live streaming from across the state, which is really exciting. And we're expecting about 70 to 90 people here in the room today. I was kind of fingers crossed hoping the rain would stay away. As Sydney-siders, we all get a bit funny about going outdoors when it rains. So hopefully we'll have people coming and going throughout the session today. So our talks will conclude today at 5:30. We've got a fairly fast-paced schedule of speakers, and at 5:30 we've got some catering arriving just in the foyer area near the registration desk. So please come and join us, have something to eat, meet some new people, and link up with any of the presenters that are able to stay around with us today. We will be circulating via email resources from these sessions, as well as a recording of the online streaming. So bear with us. We are running 3 workshops over the next month, and the last one finishes on December 7. So by the time we get all of that together, it might be heading towards that final week before the Christmas shutdown, but we will get it to you. With each of the presentations, we will take questions if we have time. We also have those on live stream. We have the Slido available for you to use to put questions through. So if you have any, please put them through. If we run out of time, I'd recommend keeping your questions to the very end and grabbing one of the presenters over a sandwich. Or if they've left, come and see Gianni or myself, and we can put those questions to the presenters on your behalf. So I think that's all from me. I'll hand over to Gianni.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. Just a little bit of background. So the Innovation Network is really a community of practice of innovation professionals from around the state. We started meeting last year, and what became apparent was that we were all really being asked lots of questions around app development and app implementation. Because it is such a challenging area, as a network we decided it would be really great if we could support the knowledge of our staff in those areas to enable you to innovate your landscapes wherever you work. And so we're really excited that you could all attend, and we're really interested to see how you all progress. We're hoping you leave inspired and with some really good practical tips on how to progress your ideas. The key messages from us are: please talk to your line manager when you go back to work. If you want to progress your idea, really great, get their support. And then also contact the key change or innovation manager on the contact sheet that was at the front desk. For those of you online, we'll email that out. Those are really great professionals that can help you navigate your district, and that's what's really important. We're also going to be creating sort of just a registry of app ideas or apps that people want to implement. That is to help us obviously collaborate across the state, but also reduce duplication. You know, we don't want everyone kind of figuring out the same things at the same time. It would be great if we could all work together. So with that done, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, who is Tim Blake. Tim is going to be presenting Marketplace Overview, and I'll just give you a short introduction. So Tim is the Managing Director of Semantic Consulting. This is a consulting firm focused on leading digital healthcare innovation. Tim helps organisations with digital health strategy and is passionate about enabling engaged patients, activating carers, use of mobile solutions in health, consumer health technology, precision medicine, consumer genomics, pharmacogenomics, and many other components of digital health. And these are all disrupting healthcare at the moment in exciting and positive ways. Tim advises digital health startups in Australia, the US, Canada, and the UK, with a particular focus on personalised medicine. He is known for his thought leadership on Twitter, which is @TimBlake1978, and through his blog. Tim has formerly held roles as Chief Information Officer at the Tasmanian Department of Health and Human Services, the Director of Rural eHealth Strategy at New South Wales Health, and Strategic Advisor at Australia's National eHealth Transition Authority and the Commonwealth Department of Health. So I think that's a pretty good CV to kick us off. So welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Gianni. I think the official term is Twitter tart. That describes it adequately. Look, I want to spend just a few minutes before I talk more about the mobile health marketplace, just setting mobile health and mobile health apps into the context of digital healthcare and some of the exciting innovation that's going on. And I want to talk about the importance of mobile health relative to some of the other pieces of that equation. So very briefly, I'm going to dwell on the fact that digital health is not the same thing as e-health. I don't know if you guys noticed, but a few years back we went through this transformation of the way that we spoke, and we started talking about e-health, digital health, as though somehow e-health had disappeared and now we had digital health. I was working for a government department at the time that did the copy, paste, and carried on with their existing mandate as though nothing had changed. I want to argue with you that digital health is not the same thing as e-health. eHealth had this mandate to look at supply-side IT systems, frankly a lot of electronic medical records, systems that helped us with safety, quality, efficiency in healthcare, but largely focused on healthcare providers. Digital health brings in some fundamental new dynamics, new technologies that bring in the health consumer in ways that we have not considered in healthcare before. And some of those things are the most exciting and potentially transformative things in digital healthcare. I don't have time to go through this, unfortunately, in great detail, but I want to say that digital health is made up of all of these pieces and more. And you'll note that you'll be familiar with the things across the top, the technologies of digital health. But I think what's also interesting here, and arguably more interesting, is also the things you could call techniques, or the things that we might call cultural dynamics, things that are changing in our society. The notion of the patient being engaged, and the literature that shows that engaged patients get far better outcomes, is one of the key dynamics of digital healthcare that we're trying to achieve through mobile health. So I don't have a great amount of time to go into these, but I want to argue with you that mobile devices and mobile apps are at the core of digital healthcare. They are right at the centre of digital healthcare. They are a linchpin to almost everything else we want to achieve. And through that fundamental piece of technology, we can then bring in many of these other elements. And I'll touch briefly on how we can use gamification and patient-reported outcomes in those mobile health models of care that we start to build. So I also want to argue about the implications of digital health and why it's different from e-health. Digital health gives us this opportunity that we haven't had before. We have this ubiquity of mobile devices. Australia, you may or may not know this, has one of the highest rates of mobile phone ownership in the OECD. Over 90% of Australian adults have a smartphone, almost regardless of socioeconomics. We have not had this opportunity before to reach deeply into the lives of patients and their carers in the way that we do today. And that is a really powerful opportunity. And I think we need to focus on mobile health apps, not just as these standalone pieces of kit that will sit on people's phones. There's a place for that, but really as bi-directional channels through which we can have access to consumers. And once we start to think about mobile apps, not as an end in themselves, but the means to an end, they're a channel through which we communicate with the consumer, we can do things we couldn't do before. We can reach into patients' lives in almost real time and not only send them information to try and modify their behaviours or to help them be educated and have better health literacy and improve their social determinants of health, but actually gather information from them. And what I want to show you today is that some of the better mobile health apps are actually deliberate, intentional models of care where the mobile health app is the front end of a carefully designed model of care. And that model of care can be used to intervene in patients' lives, to detect early stage deterioration and to do some pretty remarkable things in terms of keeping people out of hospital. So I don't want us to view mobile health apps as standalone things on phones. God knows we have enough data silos in healthcare. Who in the room would vote for more data silos? And yet, if we're not careful, this could make healthcare worse. If we go around creating more silos of information that are not connected up to our provider systems, to our electronic medical records, we seriously risk making healthcare worse. So we have to think very carefully about how mobile health apps are the face of an integrated and intentional model of care. My personal work has spanned doing a lot of this, and particularly receiving information from patients from consumer health devices, but particularly from patient-reported outcomes, which sound subjective but turn out to be a wonderful way to detect changes in patients over time and to intervene in their lives. And again, shame I can't talk more about that and the role of gamification in changing patient behaviours, but these are some of the things we can do through mobile health. I also briefly want to make my point via this very crude diagram. Now, if the socioeconomic spectrum is one-dimensional, which it's not, but as a thought experiment, let's pretend it is. If you look above the socioeconomic spectrum line, crudely, many conditions have a socioeconomic correlation, right? Relating to the social determinants of health, some conditions affect people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds disproportionately. I think we all know that. So let's think about the use of technology. Not all technologies sit equally across that socioeconomic spectrum, right? So access to home broadband and a desktop computer is something that not everyone has in this country. That tends to be a higher socioeconomic thing. Wearable devices tend to be, because of their cost, at this stage in their development, a higher socioeconomic thing. Patient engagement or participation in communities tends to be a higher socioeconomic thing, where people already have higher health literacy. And yet, what we have often done in our strategies is once we've built our EMR, we say we're going to build a patient portal. We're going to build a web portal. The My Health record is based on a patient-consumer web portal. The problem with that is there is a, I think, unconscious skew in the kinds of cohorts that we can target through that technology choice. If you run a line down the top right-hand side, people who have home broadband and a desktop computer that you need to access a web portal often are the people who are the worried well, not the cohorts we want to target. If you start from your cohort, which is often because of the condition, and it does depend on the condition, a cohort that is from a lower socioeconomic base, and trace a line down, what do you find? You find mobile and nothing else. So the point I want to make here is that mobile has to stop being this adjunct to our digital strategy where we say, I'm going to build a web portal, and if I have 20 or 30 grand left over, I'm going to build an app. And start saying, no, what cohort do I want to target, and what's the best technology choice for that cohort? That's the way we need to think about this problem, and oftentimes that has to be mobile to reach the very people that we're trying to reach. And what we've done in many cases is put out an app that is subconsciously biased. It's built by a bunch of 40-year-old white blokes like me who live on the North Shore who don't understand rural settings. right, who don't understand contexts that are not like our own, and it becomes very problematic, and we wonder why we don't get success. So briefly, mobile health apps are something that patients are actually using right now. And I was doing some digital health strategy work for Primary Health Tasmania, and we had some GPs come to us off the back of that work and say, we're getting patients coming into our practice right now saying, doctor, I'm using this mobile health app, what do you think? And of course, doctors are not well equipped. If it was medications, you could pull your MIMS book off the shelf. If it's digital health, well, where do you go? You can't really Google at the point of care. So I'm going to talk to you very briefly, and it will be a shameless piece of self-promotion about something we did in response to that, which may interest you, in order to establish the fact that I'm standing here having reviewed approximately 600 mobile health apps in the course of that work. Now, one could call that dedication, or you could call it mild Asperger's. I'm not sure which of those two it actually is. But nevertheless, it's taught me a lot about what a good mobile health app looks like. And I want to share some of that with you today. There are over 300,000 mobile health apps in the Google and Apple stores. The vast majority, if you've read the title, you've wasted some of your life. It's a phase that I refer to as the Cambrian explosion period of mobile health. You know, a large, sudden explosion of people trying things, and I think over time it will die back to things that are more sustainable. Unfortunately, many of these have no evidence, and gathering evidence really challenges the way that we do clinical trials. Often these things have come and gone in the 3 or 4 year period that we might have done a clinical trial, so they do challenge those methodologies. They're pretty unregulated. A lot of these things don't fall under active regulation by the TGA unless they form part of a Class 2 medical device. I'm ashamed to say my organisation has had more apps removed from the App Store than the TGA has, which should worry us all quite a lot. So the fact is that there are some dangerous things out there, things that are clinically unsafe, and we need some of our national organisations to step up, and there's certainly some thinking going on at the Digital Health Agency, the Safety and Quality Commission, and the Department of Health about certification schemes and other things which are very, very complex and a topic for discussion afterwards. I put in some GP views because I simply don't have equivalent data for hospital systems, but this gives you a sense. This comes from the RACGP Technology Survey. These are the kinds of apps or digital prescriptions, if you like, that GPs are making, and they fall into 4 major categories: mental health, fitness, nutrition, family planning. Those are the major areas that primary care professionals are prescribing, if you like, an act of social prescribing. But as you look at those numbers, and numbers have varied this year, the RACGP said 25%, last year they said 65%. So it's a little bit all over the place in terms of the sampling methodology, but you get the idea, it's happening. There is a portion of GPs who do this. I think one of the things holding that back is lack of knowledge and lack of trust. And I think this comes back to a broader question, and I'm not going to answer now, but the need for evidence of efficacy and how we do that in a modern digital age. There are also issues with patient literacy, and as I've said before, we've got to be very careful around our subconscious bias towards the socioeconomics of cohorts that we talk about. GPs also use apps for their own benefit. This is not just for patients, it's for clinicians too. And if only there was a trusted source. Well, ready now for the warning of the shameless self-promotion. In response to this clinical need, we ended up building something I refer to as an act of reluctant innovation. We didn't set out to do this. Some clinicians actually asked for it. I'm not quite sure the last time when someone built something that a clinician actually asked for, as opposed to thought a clinician might like something and built it. That could be a theme we could dwell on for a while. So in that sense, he was reluctant. We didn't set out with a vision that this was going to work, but we have a tool that allows you to review, rate, see quality data about, find clinical trials that have been done about approximately 600 mobile health apps, and they can be reviewed and rated. We have ways of categorizing them along the lines of SNOMED diagnoses codes, the capabilities that those apps have. You can search based on any type of metadata. Look, shameless plug over, but you get the idea. We've spent a lot of time working on a tool like this. It's now used by over 2,000 health professionals across Australia to review, rate, and even prescribe mobile apps to patients. So as I said before, probably somewhere between 30 to 65% of GPs are actually making digital prescriptions. That's not just apps, that might span fact sheets and websites and other things as well. And I was fortunate to have a workshop with 20 of Queensland's leading clinicians with Dr. Richard Ashby, and they had this oh shit moment of realising that probably 30% of their clinicians are making some form of digital recommendation today. The problem with that is that there is no written record of these recommendations, there is no quality and safety framework around those recommendations. Any recommendations that are made to patients tend to be based on the health provider's experience as a consumer, so they tend to have a post-it note with their 5 favourite apps stuck to their screen. And that's progressive, and I welcome it to a degree, but at the same time it's not a clinical safety framework that says these things are of sufficient quality to give to a patient. So it raises a number of questions. It particularly raises questions about the medico-legal liability of making recommendations. So part of the work we've done in providing what's called the Digital Health Guide that I showed you is being the beginnings of that clinical safety framework that can wrap it around auditing and the ability for an organisation to say, I'm quite happy for you to look up all these different apps, but I'm only going to let you prescribe ones that our organisation is absolutely happy with. So certainly some food for thought here. So getting to the business end of my presentation, having reviewed nearly 600 apps, yes, I don't have a life. You can probably put them into a bunch of buckets. And luckily some of the speakers coming today are going to expand on these themes, and I won't steal anything, but user experience is absolutely key. We live in the age of Apple, who have set the benchmark around user experience so high that people expect to pick something up and use it without training. That might look easy, but it's not easy to achieve. It's a major barrier to building your own products. So think very carefully as you go down this path. What I refer to as user experience war crimes. Things that are so bad that you put them down in disgust within 30 to 60 seconds. I think you know what I mean from experience, right? People can put hundreds of hours of effort in, but if it's not presented in the right way, then it's never going to fly. There is also an expectation that things get updated and updated regularly. Think about the apps that are in common use on your phone. They're things that either have fresh content or are freshly updated as an app on a regular basis, and I can show you some data on that. And does it even need to be an app? I see so many instances of things that should have been a fact sheet. And someone had 30 grand and they thought, I'm going to build an app. And you know what? It's worse as an app than it would have been as a fact sheet. Again, you have to ask yourself some of these tough questions before you go into building apps. We don't do it for its own sake. And lastly, and I think worse, is this idea of another data silo. Right? We don't need more data silos. We need things that are, as I said, part of an intentionally designed model of care. By all means, bring the patient into the model of care, but any data they're giving you needs to be integrated into the picture of that patient that we have more broadly. So that's the bad ones. The meh ones, as I refer to them, often are very point functionality. The reality is people are not going to have 100 health apps on their phone and go to each one for each condition. My hypothesis is that people probably have 3 to 5 things that they use maximum. And you have to make your way into that list of utility, user experience, functionality, integration. You have to be in that top 3 to 5 for that particular patient if you're going to be on regular rotation. There are huge numbers of downloads, but the evidence shows us that people's use of mobile health apps drops off incredibly quickly. So using techniques to engage people, whether that be gamification or regular content, are critical as part of your strategy. I think you can guess, based on what I've said already, the strong mobile health apps have a wonderful focus on user experience. They are designed based on the cohort they're trying to influence. And that's, I can't emphasize that point enough. Start from the cohort. Who are you trying to target? And if it's everyone, rip that up and try again. You're not going to reach everyone through a single app. If it's a lower socioeconomic cohort, 40% of Tasmanians are functionally illiterate. It doesn't mean they can't read and write, but it means they struggle to do everyday tasks. The kind of things that me, a 40-year-old white man from the North Shore, thinks that people should be able to do are not going to be right first time round. We have to think very carefully about that. Also, I'd add that offline functionality is absolutely key for people living in rural and remote areas. Just a couple more slides in conclusion. So from the Digital Health Guide, we're able to derive some really interesting data, and this is a scatter graph that shows the correlation on the y-axis is the App Store score, and on the x-axis is how many times per month they're updated. And I did this as a bit of fun, but what it effectively shows us is that there is a kind of correlation going on here that has, I think, a sweet spot for the number of times per month you update an app. There is an expectation in the minds of consumers that probably peaks out somewhere around 1.5 to 2 times a month that you'll be updating an app that regularly. So lastly, before developing an app, and I know some of you are already well into this process, and I'm sure you've thought about or learned to think about many of these things. Has somebody done this before? All the time I advise clients who go, I've got this great idea. I'm like, yeah, that's great. You know, there's someone who's been doing that for years and has basically cornered the market already. That's an important piece of research before you spend any of your money. Does it need to be an app at all? Is there a case that it could not be an app? We need to be pragmatic about this. The App Store will not give you a leg up. There are 300,000 of these things. People won't find your one. They just won't. Gone are the days when the App Store gives you free marketing that has any consequence. Will you meet user expectations of great user experience? Well, I think one of our following speakers is going to talk more about that. And I'm going to create another data silo. Most importantly, can this be part of a model of care that we have designed to do things intentionally that becomes that digital channel into the patient? And you know what? In 5 years, in 10 years, that digital channel might not be the mobile device anymore. It might be a wearable device. It might be something embedded in clothing. If you see this as a digital channel, you'll see it for what it is, a means to an end that might shift over time, and you might design what you build accordingly. And how can I measure the efficacy of what I built? How can I give clinical credibility to this? Lastly, is this really going to make healthcare better? I hope that's been a good but brief overview of this space. Certainly food for thought that will be expanded on by the following speakers, but yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Certainly a great starting point, I think, and lots of great questions there to finish on for consideration. So in terms of time constraints, we've got time for a question from the audience. Is there anything that was pressing, burning at this point that anyone wanted to put forward?
What's in your top 5?
So the question was around what's in the top 5 for Tim.
So you mean my top 5 apps that I use? Yeah, look, some would be in the physical exercise category, the things I pay for, something like a Strava or Runkeeper. There's a particular app out of the US that I've had a bit to do with their organisation, not financially, but just because I think it's the best model of care I've seen, called Lifeguard Health Networks is the organisation. You should definitely look at them and their products. It's absolutely amazing. They're being used for early intervention for patients post-hospitalisation during cancer care. So that's another one. Gamified apps, so something like Zombies Run. I don't know if you've ever been chased by zombies. Me and my 10-year-old son have been chased by zombies quite regularly, and it causes him to say to me, Dad, can we go for a run? So gamification really can work to incentivise different groups in different ways. So there's 3 for you. Yep.
Thank you very much, Tim. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Oliver Viably, who's the Director of Design and Innovation at Mobile Experience. With a background in psychology and how people interact with technology, Oliver has consulted on mobile and user experience for over 18 years to most major Australian corporations, including telcos, banks, publishers and airlines. His clients include Optus, Telstra, Combac, HCF, Comsec, NRMA, Atlassian, Qantas and a range of Australian startups. Very busy man. Oliver chaired the AIMIA Mobile Industry Group for 4 years, the Mobile Monday networking event for 8 years and is a mentor advisor to startups. Oliver is an invited speaker to local and international conferences by Google, Microsoft, Web Directions, CBIT and New South Wales Innovation Network. I've just thrown that in. And he's worked on a range of mobile app projects in the health space, from commercial delivery for health insurers to preclinical trial in the health space of apps for people with bipolar and the SANE network, to an app for smart yoga, wearables, and now working with a startup focused on wearable for Army veterans with PTSD. He was an invited member to the federal government's DHS Strategy and Innovation Council, and he lectures on interaction design at Sydney Uni and has run user experience training for a range of digital agencies as well as government departments. So please join me in welcoming Oliver to talk to us today about the stages of app development. It's all right.
Thank you, Dan and Yanni. So, today what I thought I'd do is talk, do I need to be close to this? Today what I thought I'd do is give you a brief background about me, not long on that, just to give you some examples because we just talked through that. But then really look at a number of aspects of mobile app development. So things that you need to think about when you're coming up with your ideas or you're generating your approach to mobile, your mobile strategy. Just to keep in mind, and in some cases hopefully to give you processes to work through. So a couple of the projects that Dan just mentioned. This one's got we did this for CES and a company called Wearable Experiments. They're a pair of yoga tights with sensor wire woven through them and haptic feedback around the waist, the ankles and the knees. So we can tell where you are when you're trying to do your downward dog, and we can give you a little tap and go, hey, move your hips over that way, you're not quite in line yet, things like that. So that was a fun one. And you can buy them now. I think they're about $200 or something US. HCF, of course, working with health insurers. And this was one we did with the SANE network for reflecting objective data on people's mobile use back to themselves, and also sharing that with either a carer, a family member or a friend to potentially provide them insight into their mobile usage. And this was before the whole Google and Apple screen time sort of became obvious. We did this about 2 years ago. So that people could have conversations and look at patterns and look at whether there was a correlation between certain patterns of behaviour and then the onset of episodes for bipolar. And then recently we've been working with a startup run by Chris Reese-Edwards, which is looking at Army veterans, and it's particularly using a wearable to look at the algorithm and how we can detect the onset and the intensity of a PTSD episode for those, starting with veterans, but potentially moving it out from there as well. And then this was one we did for a virtual reality company who are looking at stroke rehabilitation, and in this case we actually worked with the clinicians to design an interface. So this is the clinician's experience of watching their patient go through that VR experience and looking at behavioural cues and rewards and so on. So things we're going to talk about today. I thought we'd have a brief look at why is mobile different, what is it about this device or these devices that makes it interesting. Hello, Anthony. And really there's a bunch of stuff that we can look at. The first one is obviously it's personal. There's been no doubt that this has been probably the most personal device, or electronic device, that we've ever had with us. It carries our memories of, the photos that we just took on holiday, where we've got to go, of course, people's contact details, etc. And again, back to Tim's point, this, while that is generally right, it also varies. So one of our team members has been out working with the Indigenous community where there is much more prevalent use of things like shared devices. So we're looking at the implications of those. How does that change when it isn't personal? It's portable and pocketable. Obviously, you can just throw it in your pocket and go along. And that has huge implications to not only the people's access to the device, obviously, and the services that you might be offering, but also the information that you might be capturing. So things like steps and movement and so on. And then there's the connection as well. As Tim alluded to, watching the mobile industry change over the last 18 years has been phenomenal, from very text-based services, obviously, through our early adoption of the 3G network, right through. This connectivity is almost an expectation now, that we expect to be connected to data, and when we aren't, it can be quite disruptive to what we think we can do with our device or what our habits are. So what do we do under circumstances where there might not be connectivity or might not be reliable? And then constraint. Of course, the mobile device itself is one of those devices that has a number of inputs, and a lot of the human input is around text entry and things like that, or can be. And that in itself, a small screen size, tricky text input, we're still not quite there with speech on a number of fronts, but what are the complications around that? So you need to think about those constraints. I had a friend, a colleague of mine, who used to lecture to students, and she was lecturing when the first iPhone came out, and she sort of asked the students, so you're all going to go and buy one of these devices? And a lot of them actually said no, and she was quite interested in why, and they were saying, well, at the time, and this is 10 years ago now, they were able to use their 9 or 12 key keypad to actually text under the table because they could physically feel where those numbers were. Now, you can't do that with a glass screen, right? But I would say that if we went and talked to those people today, they would have given that up as a compromise, that ease of entry and that familiarity of entry for full screen apps or full screen images or richer experiences via those devices. And then the last one there, I think, is the most exciting aspect of mobile and where we're going. And back to Tim's point, we have to be very aware of privacy and aspects like that. But the ability to create unique experiences based on context and a whole range of contextual elements and information is hugely valuable to create unique and valuable user experiences. So many of you might have heard the term mobile first, and I thought we'd just quickly address the three core components of why Luke Wroblewski sort of coined the phrase and wrote the book on this, and look at the opportunities around that when you're addressing your mobile strategy. The first reason that people might design a service actually from the mobile perspective first, it's not to say that you can't have a desktop counterpart or whatever it might be, but that first and foremost, as Tim's slides alluded, clearly stated, that most people have a mobile device now, especially in Australia, but also the developing world. It is the dominant electronic device for communication. The second one there is, because of the limitations, those constraints that I mentioned on the first slide, that does need us to focus in on what are the core tasks and the core services and the core things that these people who are using these apps want to do and need to do. And I think the wonderful byproduct of a lot of this is that a lot of people who have who use VoiceOver or a different way of navigating for accessibility reasons actually use things like the Apple Watch or iPhone with VoiceOver and Android and similar, because they are much more focused experiences and they don't have to navigate around a huge website. They're always with them, okay? And aspects like that which allow these experiences to be much more accessible. But focusing on the core of what you're trying to achieve is key. And again, back to Tim's point, it means that you're less likely trying to be doing everything, but really focusing on what needs to be done. And then the third one there is sort of the exciting bit, in that a lot of innovation happens on the mobile side, far more than any other sort of technology area. And therefore, there's all these new aspects that are constantly coming into the space that we can leverage from an innovation perspective. So it gives us lots of things to play with. And he talked about these in relation to 3 apps, and it's just to really frame up his discussion. The first one, obviously Instagram doesn't really make sense unless you've got a camera on a mobile device and a full screen to show people photos. Uber doesn't make sense if you don't know where people are and you don't have stored credit card details, right? It just changes the whole experience fundamentally. And then Snapchat is not something that I understand, so I'll just... The mobile platforms, and this slide, I teach at Sydney Uni in General Assembly, and this slide over the years has diminished in the number of devices and operating systems that it's had. We used to have, of course, Windows Phone, and we used to have BlackBerry, and now we've really sort of focused back, and globally, we've focused back, generally speaking, on iOS and Android are the two major platforms. For 10 years, as part of the Australian Interactive Media Industry Association, I co-authored a report on how Australians use their phone. And it was fascinating to watch the manufacturer and the OS changes over that period of time. Generally speaking, we are quite an iOS dominant market. A lot of the people who are engaged in it doesn't mean that's the most sales. It means that the people who tend to engage more with mobile services for one reason or another will tend to come from an iOS device. Apple, yeah, iOS, sorry, is the Apple platform, Apple operating system for your iPhone and iPad. So a lot of our clients, and also going along with that, a lot of the monetary aspects. So it tends to be a higher socioeconomic bracket that owns those devices. So for a lot of commercial clients, that's the area that they tend to start with, okay? But Android is such a dominant player here as well that you can't really, unless you have a very good reason, just deliver on one platform if you're delivering a native experience. The way I like to frame this, and this is a way of thinking about the different types of apps that you can create. Okay, so on the far right there, you have what we call a generic mobile website, and we'll talk a bit more about progressive web apps in a moment, which is sort of a superset of that, or a subset, sorry, I should say, of that. There are different ways of creating these things. So generic mobile web is really just a website that is designed to render appropriately on a mobile screen. Back in the day at Optus and similar organisations, we would have hundreds of different types of browsers that we'd need to cater for with different capabilities and things like that. I'll talk a bit more later about how that's simplified over time. Then you have what we call hybrid apps, and that's those middle two columns there. And essentially what they're doing is taking a website and they're adding a bit of code. Are there any developers in the room? Yeah, one. It's really simple. It's just a couple of lines of code, and you can wrap up your website and stick it in the App Store, essentially. Okay. Now, with that, there's two approaches. The first one is we can take a mobile website, put that little bit of code around it, and put it in the Android App Store, the Google Play Store, or an APK, which is a specific file that people might download to install an app on their Android device. Or you can create an Apple version of that. Now, Apple talks specifically about you can't just take a website, wrap it simply, and then put it in the App Store. They do have some further requirements. So we call it a thin native wrapper when you really don't have to add any functionality, and we call it a thick native wrapper when you have to add some functionality. And then there's the third option, which is a full native app approach, where you're developing it in those specific tool sets for those specific platforms. And all the content is coming through APIs or other systems to supply that. So I'll go through the strengths and weaknesses of each just to articulate that in a bit more detail. The first one is mobile web. When we designed ABC's first mobile website, ABC as a remit had the job to inform Australia's population. So they weren't going to go and create an iOS-only app or a BlackBerry-only app at the time. They needed to allow everybody to get their information. And browsers, while there's a wide variety of them, they do allow a similar level of access. So it's only the higher end functionality that somebody on a mobile website might miss out if they don't have one of the newer devices or the newer operating systems with the newer browsers on them. And then you have the web technologies, and these are quite powerful. And there's HTML5 and CSS3 allow a lot of rich and engaging experiences on mobile websites. And there is a whole area now. Jason Griggs just released a great book a couple of days ago called Progressive Web Apps that looks at these three core components of technology. So HTTPS, so ensuring it's a secure site, a secure website. Things called service workers, which you don't need to know the detail about, but basically it's about caching content and being able to cache your mobile website on your phone, even though you might not be connected to the internet, or data within that app, and even though you might not be connected to the internet. And then a web app manifest, which is just a complex way of saying it's a web page with some information that tells it that it is like an app. So what's the name of it? You can add it to your home screen and it will have an icon and look exactly like an app, those sorts of things. So progressive web apps can be really useful if you've got really infrequent use, but you do need a powerful set of things. There's a bunch of requirements and things. You can do push notifications, you can link to them, they can be enhanced experiences and so on. And of course, with web, developers are more available. With mobile web, the weaknesses, in terms of user interface, there are some design constraints, and they've certainly reduced over the years. The browsers are getting more and more powerful. But things like the consistency of the experience across a range of devices can vary quite significantly. So certainly when we were doing things like Westpac's mobile banking and stuff like that, we would come up with these great concepts of, okay, well, we want to have this drag and drop thing, and yes, these browsers and these iPhones and these Android devices can all do that, but there's all these bunch of devices that don't do that. So from a client perspective or a customer perspective, they're saying, well, does that mean then we have to have two designs because one of them can do it really well and one of them can't? And therefore we need to maintain two code bases. So what tends to happen is they go, don't worry about the flashy one, just give us the normal one, okay, that works on everything. And then you tend to degrade to a more generic experience. Excuse me. Poor transitions and animations, again, they're getting a lot closer to what you can do with a native app, but there still can be variations across those browsers and devices. And as I said before, we used to have to deal with hundreds of different browsers from Motorola and Samsung, etc. But now they tend to consolidate on a single rendering engine, which we call WebKit, which was developed out of Nokia and by Apple, etc. And it was really adopted by a whole bunch of people for a while. And Google have sort of forked off a bit into Blink, but generally speaking, there's still a lot of applicability to mobile websites working on everything. You just need to be aware and test on a range of devices when you are doing this. And the trick with progressive web apps, and it is sort of Apple haven't fully adopted all the aspects of progressive web apps, so you need to be aware of the limitations of what your iOS market might not get out of that progressive web app. We had a project recently that was for the general consumer, and it started off being a progressive web app, but because of some of the specific functionality that we needed around Bluetooth and a variety of aspects, we decided not to go down that path and then go fully native. This is just a little insight, I suppose. We always think about the user experience certainly from a visual and aesthetic UI perspective. But we have to remember that the technologies that we employ behind these systems have a big impact on that user experience. This was a client that came to us who was working on a strategy project, and it was in women's fashion. So essentially these were their competitors. Unfortunately, they were site number one. And what we're looking at is the page weight, so how big the page is, the web page is in kilobytes in that sense, and the load time. And you can see there that their competitors were far faster. So if you're looking across a bunch of dresses or whatever the item might be, you can imagine that user experience being faster has a huge impact on how many products you can see, whether you can find the right thing within the time, whether you switch to the competitor, whatever it might be. So being conscious of the implications of some of your technology decisions on the user experience is key. What you'll actually notice is that the red dots at the load time, even though the size of the pages of 3 and 4 are actually bigger than sites 2 and 3, they load almost the same. So site 3 is almost the optimal, right? It's quite a large page, which means it might have some really nice, rich images, but it still loads super fast because they've optimized the web code and things like that. Hybrid app strengths. So it's this model where we take a website and we wrap it in code, and so therefore you can put them in the App Store, so you can put it in the Apple App Store or Google Play Store or wherever that might be. And the benefit for that is you don't need to whenever you do an update, you don't need to resubmit it to the App Store. You can change that web content in the background. So one of Westpac's mobile banking back in the early days was all hybrid based, and so they could change things whether it was a security concern or whatever it might have been, without having to rely on Apple or whoever it might be passing that through the App Store in a timely way. And the other benefit of the hybrid app approach is consolidating the experience. So way back in the day when the iPhone first came out, if you downloaded the CommBank app, you would download the app, you would go, I want to log into CommBank banking, and it would actually shut the app, go and open the mobile web browser, and then ask you for your username and password. And people at the time would sort of freak out about this and go, well, hang on, the app that I was just supposed to enter these important details in is closed, and now I'm at a web page. What's going on? So with the Westpac one of the key wins was we kept them within that app experience. Even though it was a web page, it felt to them like they were still in that app. They were still in that app. It was just through a website. And then the trick with hybrid is that if you do some lovely native things in one area of the app, so you might have these rich gestural aspects or whatever, and then they go to a web page aspect of your app and they try to do the same things, they might not work. So it's just more about consistency from that perspective. On the native side, tend to be richer user interfaces. We used to look at pixel specific interfaces, like especially for the iPhone. It was a one size, one screen resolution for a bunch of years. But now we need to make sure that all our screens are adaptive to different size devices, whether that's just on the iOS platform or across Android and iOS. They tend to be a bit more responsive because they are locally on the device itself. Then you're not going out to get content. Less data to download because of that as well. Obviously the app stores. And that last point there is certainly for a lot of our clients who are playing in the more innovative space is that technologies will tend to come to the native apps first because they're built into the SDK by the platforms themselves. So things like Bluetooth, GPS, all of those first came to native apps. Some of them have then progressed out to general web standards, but to create a web standard tends to take a bunch more years. So where you're doing something a bit more innovative, it tends to be more on the app side, native app side. Of course, it means you've got to download an app, so you've got to prompt your patient or whoever it is to actually go to the App Store and to get that. There's a number of ways you can do that to get them there more easily, but it's still a process. And in some cases, updates can take longer to reach customers. So sometimes that's an approval process, though these days that's negligible. It's not really a big issue, but it's something you need to be aware of, that does need to go through approval. And sometimes it's just habits. So for a long time, Android did a great job of doing automatic updates to your apps, and these days iOS does, unless you elect not to. But people, aren't always aware that there might be a new version of the app which might run into issues with security or privacy or current content. And then, of course, with native apps, you need to have one per platform, right? You need to have an Android app and an iOS app, again, depending on your audience. And because of that, they therefore require more specialist skills to develop each of those options. So in terms of general approaches, this is a very high-level look, and by no means is it the definitive way of looking at this, but this is a broad approach. But obviously you want to do some research. I think, certainly coming from a user experience perspective, the key thing that we always talk about is what is the problem you're trying to solve for your customer or client or patient or whoever it might be, practitioner. What are the needs and behaviours that they have that you understand, and that's not sitting somewhere and going, I think they have this problem, so we'll develop this app. It's going out and witnessing that or getting first-hand information and first-hand research to understand those issues so that you can really fully grasp that and then take that into a concept and to try to ideate around, okay, well, what is the process that, or what are the technologies, or what are the platforms, of which mobile might be one, wearables might be another, TV might be one, desktop obviously another, etc., etc. What will support this person trying to do what they're trying to do? And then go through a design and refinement iteration of sketching stuff up, then moving it to wireframes, and then moving to visual design. And do you have some more information on UX and so on later? So we're going to talk about those aspects. And then development as well. And even this diagram sort of goes, well, you design and refine and then you develop. And these days we're moving to a different model where there's sort of more iterations through that. And I'll talk about that shortly. So then it goes through a development cycle and then you launch it. And I think too often we certainly see our clients who sort of go, okay, well, we've hit our launch and that's it. We're great and we're good and we've got it out there. And back to Tim's slide, those people who update, and that doesn't need to be significant updates. It can be refreshing content, as you mentioned, or adding little functionality, or just bug fixes, right? All of that builds up to more engagement. And so you want to monitor that. There's sort of the traditional model of development, which is waterfall, and it's very much, we do some research, we get that research, we hand it to the designer designs something, then the designer hands the designs to the developer, and then the developer develops that thing, and then it goes and launches, right? So it's a waterfall, it cascades down through that process. And what we've been moving towards is more an agile method where there's short iterations of, we might learn something, then we'll sketch something up, and then we'll create a prototype, and then we might put that into development, and we build a little bit of it, and then we go and check that with some people, or we put it out and we test it in market. Combank actually have a whole app called the X-Labs app, which is for playing around with stuff, right, and things that they're testing and playing with. And then you go back through the cycle and go, actually, that didn't quite work, so let's reiterate that. And you go in, what are these agile sprints to get there. But one thing that I think might be interesting to you is things called design sprints, and sort of Google really kicked off a lot of these, where you do these short sprint, so usually 4 or 5 day workshops, where you've got key decision makers, the CTO, the CEO, or key people in the business, right, who all get together with the designer, with the product manager, with the project manager, and do a very short cycle of, how do we want to approach this problem? What are the key issues? How might it look? Let's do some sketches and stuff like that. So, this is an example of that. So, in this case, business research might be going and doing a bunch of stakeholder interviews, reviewing a bunch of documentation on prior research. We're working with children's oncology project at the moment to look at effects of fitness activity on long-term health outcomes. So it's reviewing a lot of medical research, obviously, around what happens in the adult populations and so on. Doing some customer research, coming up with personas, scenarios, customer journey maps, and I'll give you some examples of those shortly. Creating a concept model, UIs, doing some concept stuff, fleshing it out a bit more, doing some thinking, testing the wireframes, so these very high-level overview or very light sketches of what you might do, and then take that through another process. So this is some research we did for the Museum of Contemporary Art, which was just putting a kiosk in the front of the building, right, and saying, hey, we'll give you 3 screens, you come up with the 3 things that you think you should put into the app, and we'd have these conversations with them, and they would put them up on the wall of the MCA, and they would write little descriptions about what they wanted from the app. There's a lot of first-hand stuff. So for 2 years, I wore 4 fitness trackers to look at the different roles they played. Even though they were pretty much 4 black rubber bands, the displays on them, the wearability of them, what happened to my data? Like Nike owned all my data, right? I couldn't access that data. So playing around with this stuff firsthand is really key. Usually at the start of the project, you'll come up with things like design principles. Okay, so what are the aim of the things that you're trying to do? That's an example of one. Come up with a bunch of UX goals. So what are you trying to achieve from a user experience perspective? And then, please, make sure that you set up metrics. Oh, there you go. Yeah, I'm off. We kicked over in a sec. To measure those. And then there's things like concept models, which articulate the overarching structure of this. There's personas, so you want to cover the main audiences that you're dealing with, and then you can start to look at aspects of those personas. What might happen to Sammy today, because he's got juvenile diabetes, and what might happen with the service in the future once you implement yours, and how might that look in a screen-by-screen sort of scenario play out. So, top 3 tips: be driven by customer needs, or whoever your audience is, by their needs and behaviours. Make sure you understand that and look for those alignment opportunities. This isn't about your business and your business success, it's about helping people. Understand the strengths and weaknesses of those 3 approaches that I talked about: mobile, web, hybrid, and then native. And then make sure that this isn't a let's hit a launch date and we're done and we can walk away. Make sure that you're planning for the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Oliver. We just have a question from online. Did you want to read that?
Hopefully this is a quick question, a quick answer. We've just had one come through asking about costs of architects.
my initial thought is how long's a piece of string? It depends on the update. So obviously if it's bug fixes, then that could be quite small, whereas if it's adding features and functionality, it would be significant. And again, it's really going to be how much is your app to start with and what's the complexity of that app. Again, are you doing native apps across 2 platforms, or is this a mobile website? So what's that dev cost? What's that, the complexity of that?
Are there any questions from the audience? We'll probably have time for one.
Unfortunately, I have to zap off, so apologies. But if anyone has any further questions later on, feel free to reach out on those details. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you, Oliver. So the next speaker, I'd like to introduce 2 speakers. We have Lois Villarosa, who's the Policy and Briefing Officer in the Investment Strategy and Architecture branch at eHealth. Lois is a privacy officer there with legal and economics background. Speaking after Lois is Michael Cassetto, who's a lawyer. Michael heads up the corporate and commercial team at Bartier Perry, a mid-sized Sydney-based law firm. Michael has been practicing law for about 25 years with a particular focus on intellectual property, information technology, consumer law and data protection and privacy matters. Michael regularly advises clients about app development. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm here to talk about, in general, about privacy and data in terms of the legal framework. But please note that everything I give is not legal advice, and seek your own legal advice in regards to your individual matters. The reason why I'll get to soon after. So to start off with, privacy. As you know and are aware through the media and the community discussion, privacy is something essential to our everyday lives. It touches on our very person. So privacy in our interactions at work, with our family, with the community is quite important. And something as ubiquitous as a mobile app, something that is installed onto our phone. Oh, sorry, I forgot my phone. But it's quite benign to see a little square on your screen. What is this? It's essentially, in my personal opinion, something that connects us to the world, and something that provides information to us, but also back to the world as we enter information back and forth, and as we communicate with the community. So when we're, as developers, app developers, and you're thinking of what should I make my app to be, or how should I design it, privacy should be at the forefront. Now, I saw this quote from Giovanni Briatelli, who's the European Data Protection Supervisor. So the EU has a very rigorous data regime, but they recognize that legal frameworks and social norms aren't a complete picture in terms of innovation and how we develop technology these days, but actually how we actually use the features of this technology, and how do we conciliate privacy and technology together. So when you're thinking about your design, when you're going through the design process, and when you're developing these apps and thinking, oh, which features should I put in? What information should I put in? You should think privacy. How would the concerned individual would react to having their information sit on someone's device? And just have that thought in place. So if there's any takeaway from my presentation, that would be my takeaway. Just having this at the forefront of your consideration would make a huge difference. So what is privacy by design, by the way? It's being proactive. It's embedding privacy by default into your design. It's by default, your settings are to protect the individuals and to protect the information that you hold in the apps. It's also full functionality. Just because you're embedding privacy into your app doesn't mean that you should cut off all the functionality. End-to-end security, having visibility and transparency, and respect for the user's privacy as well. So obviously, in each jurisdiction, where you intend your app to be used, will it be solely within New South Wales Health? Will it be an app solely used for within Australia or worldwide? Just use your imagination. Different laws, different policies would apply. Now, the focus of my presentation today will come with the assumption that you're developing an app for New South Wales Health and within New South Wales Health, because I know through the different vendors that we come across that a lot of these vendors would like to integrate their apps into our systems, into New South Wales Health systems, to connect to the EMRs, to connect so then you can pull up the diagnostic images as they come up. But and so we have particular limitations which will seem to be barriers to you, but they are legal requirements that need to be abided by. So the Health Records and Information Privacy Act is a special legislation that touches only those who are New South Wales government agencies. The Privacy Personal Information Protection Act, same, and Health Administration Act, and so on. So the ones listed in New South Wales are generally applied to New South Wales Health. But we do have some interactions depending on the different forms of or types of organizations. So if you're intending to have an app that will be used within Australia and not just New South Wales Health, then you also have to consider the Privacy Act. And if you want an app that touches a resident of the EU, then you will need to abide by the General Data Protection Regulation, not commonly known as GDPR. So, as I was alluding to in my previous slide, that the legal requirements will depend on the circumstances, not just where you're intending to, where your app is intending to be used in, but also the different uses of the app, whether where it's going to be, who's going to see the information. But for New South Wales Health, we also have, on top of privacy requirements, there's also the State Records Act that you need to abide by, which is basically data retention which could range from a couple of years to forever. So it's something you need to be aware of when you're developing your app. I won't take you through the privacy principles that are encased within legislation, because as the different circumstances are, it varies. But I'll point out some scenarios and things that will at least hopefully capture your attention and help you to think in the right direction. As always, seek legal advice for your specific apps. So the first one is, who owns the app? Are you getting funding from the LHD, from New South Wales Health, or are you independently developing it out of your own bat? So these would have copyright and IP implications beyond privacy. And what type of app are you developing? Will this app be used for clinical trials, or just one clinical trial, or for many clinical trials for research purposes? Will you need, does this type of app act as an information sharing This question is quite wide in terms of it has policy implications, privacy implications, security, data linkages, and consent implications, and have a whole host of laws that would need to be considered. So who will use the app? Will it be an app used by our clinicians within New South Wales Health, or will it be an app used by private hospitals? So in that case, if it's New South Wales Health, you have the New South Wales legislation, but if private hospitals will also use this app, then the Privacy Act will apply. Will it be used by our clinicians, or will it be used by our patients? There will be different expectations and requirements depending on who uses the app and who can update the app. So in general, the person to whom the information pertains to in terms of personal and health information, they have a right to update their information. So will they be able to review the information that gets put in this app, or and likewise? So this question has privacy implications, data retention, and consent. And what is consent? Are we relying on implied consent, or is there explicit express consent? Also, what type of what type of information will the app capture and store? So will your app, so as you can just read, so the type of information that the app will capture and store will have privacy and data retention implication, and to whom will this information be disclosed to? Will it be disclosed only to the clinicians? Who will be supporting the app? How will you maintain the database? And that will have implications in terms of your vendors. Do they have access to the data or not? So significant privacy implications here. Has consent being obtained from your patients as to whether you can use this app in a form that's never been used before? Who will be storing the information? Where will this information be stored? Will it be within New South Wales Health data centres, or will it be on a public cloud or elsewhere? What platform will your app will be available? Will it be in an Apple store, or will you tie it up with Facebook or Twitter? Again, numerous implications that you need to think about. And how will the user-added content be moderated? So there are apps with discussion boards or where they can post messages. How will you remediate or look after this information so it's safe and secure and it's retaining privacy? And does your app really need all this information that you're collecting? Or can you get away with less information and still have the same functionality? And what security measures will be included? And what happens to the information once the app is deleted or the subscription ends? So we go back to the data retention requirements required by the State Archives Act. And what happens if there's a data breach? Have you thought about your processes to maintain, to secure, and to react to these data breaches? And I've compiled some resources. These are very useful sites for those who would like more information in regards to privacy in general and our policies, the Privacy Manual for Health Information, and the legislation legislation website, which you can access all the legislation. And if you have any further would like to develop an app that's within New South Wales Health, I suggest that you go to your legal team for further legal advice. And for those who have an app and would like e-health support, Toby and Mona are happy to take questions and to support you on your way. Thank you.
Lois, we've just got one question from online.
The question that's come through is, has New South Wales Health received any GDPR requests from EU patients travelling to Australia? And does New South Wales Health have a published policy on this?
The short answer is I'm not sure of the first one. I'm still getting my head around it because that came into force earlier this year, and we don't have a policy on it yet.
And with that, just one more question as well that you might be able to answer now. Should eHealth be notified for all app developments?
I wouldn't say all app developments. For those, so I need to word this carefully. So in terms of self-developed apps, but you're interested in integrating with our systems, definitely. I think that's all I can say.
Thank you very much. Definitely, I think definitely any app that involves any patient data, as part of New South Wales Health, yes, you should involve eHealth. Great. Now I'd like to invite Michael.
Hey, thanks for that. Now, some of you might have noticed, that I'm growing a moustache. I'm not Chopper Reed. I'm doing the Movember thing. And, you know, when deciding about the Movember thing, I could have probably gone for something a bit more subtle. But the whole idea of Movember is trying to raise awareness for health issues that are suffered by men. And in particular, I just thought I'd take this opportunity then to sort of try and raise awareness by, one, growing this hideous moustache, and secondly, by just pointing out that 43 men die from prostate cancer every hour. I'm sure some of you people might know these stats. Testicular cancer is the most common cancer suffered by young men, and every minute a man dies from suicide. So I've lived up to my pledge as far as Movember is concerned. So, you know, if you would like to donate to Movember, I'm sure that you'd be able to find my Movember page quite easily by going to the Movember website, because I'm sure I'm the only Michael Cassetto doing Movember. But anyway, all right, so I'm not here to talk about Movember, I'm here to talk about the legalities and regulations. And Lois has already sort of spoken about privacy. I thought Lois might be going after me, which is why it says the next presentation, but it was the previous presentation. So Lois is talking about privacy. There are a number of other kind of legal or regulatory issues that you should probably take into account. Obviously, in the health care sector, there's a heap of regulation. Obviously, you know, because the primary consideration is the well-being of the patients, and so you can understand that there'd be a lot of regulation around that. Some of the other things that some of the other regulatory issues that I'll talk about other than privacy is I'll have a look at the TGA. I think Tim sort of touched on that very, very briefly. We don't have a lot of time, but I'll try and give you a quick overview of where the TGA sits on health apps. Consumer guarantees is an area that you probably need to have a think about. Just from a liability point of view, there's advertising, so what regulations concern advertising of apps. Security, just I'll sort of flag security and whether there's any laws that you need to be aware of. And then lastly, ownership. So first of all, I guess the big question is your health app going to be something that needs to be regulated by the TGA? The Therapeutic Goods Act, it includes a definition of medical devices, or it regulates medical devices. The definition of medical devices set out in this section 41, capital B, capital D. I've taken a part of it. This is not the whole definition, but it's just a part of it. And I've tried to highlight some of the words that I think are probably more relevant to the health app, and that. So the definition: it will be a medical device if it's an instrument, apparatus, appliance that includes software, which is used for diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment, or alleviation of disease. Now, Tim kind of mentioned some of the apps that are around. I think the other speaker, Oliver, might have mentioned some of the apps that he was aware of. And it's not hard to see how a health app could fall within that definition of medical device, because if it helps diagnose, monitor, prevent or alleviate a condition, then it may fall within that definition. So apps, there's lots of different types of apps. There's some apps that just provide information. There's apps that collect data from the user of the app, and they might be used to help monitor or give some health message back to the user. So if there are these health messages like, the user has a particular condition, or the user is at risk of a condition, or, a condition might be getting better or worse, well, they're things that suggest that it could be an app that falls within this definition of medical device. But not all medical apps, or health apps I should say, will fall within that definition of medical device, because just because it's related to health doesn't mean that it is a medical device. And an app is unlikely to be a medical device if it only does one of the things that are listed on this slide. So if it just gives generic advice, it's not going to be something that the TGA is going to be too concerned about. If it just gives you a reminder to take medication, again, it doesn't fall within that definition of medical devices, so you probably won't be caught. If your app is a medical device, what does that mean? Basically, it means that you would need to have that included on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. In order to do that, the app will need to meet what the TGA has a set of what they call essential principles for safety and performance. Those things include that the app, must not compromise health or safety, that it has to be suitable for its intended use, and the benefits must outweigh any undesirable effects, that kind of thing. So they're just the general sort of essential principles. You'll also need to then get a conformity certificate, just to make sure that the app conforms to the requirements of the Therapeutic Goods legislation. But one of the big things, I guess, with the Therapeutic Goods Act is that if you do fall within that definition of medical device, you'll need to get listed on the ARTG, but you'll also need to comply with the Therapeutic Goods Advertising Code. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when I talk about advertising. But for now, I'll just point out the fact that there has been a code since 2015. That code is starting to be wound down, and a new code is coming into force from the 1st of January 2019, so in about 6 weeks or so. So I'll talk about the advertising later. But look, one thing that I should just say is that the regulation of health apps by the regulation of health apps that are medical devices is basically done on a risk-based approach, right, by the TGA. So obviously the TGA will look at the apps, and if they fall within medical device, well then you'll need to consider, is it something that perhaps is treating a life-threatening disease? Then obviously the TGA is going to pay more attention to that than if it's just an app just giving someone just a bit of generic information or other type of information, right? So just bear that in mind when you're designing your app. If you are designing an app that perhaps could save lives, then and it would fall within that medical device definition, then you should be expecting that you're going to get a bit of scrutiny from the TGA. Next issue I just want to talk about is consumer guarantees. So under our Australian consumer law, there are what are called consumer guarantees, and they apply basically to the supply of goods and services to consumers. So the question becomes, well, what's a consumer? Consumer is someone who acquires either goods or services for personal, household or domestic use, or if those goods or services are less than $40,000. Now, in the case of a health app would not necessarily be considered to be a good, because you're not supplying something that's tangible, but you would be providing a service. Right? So you're providing someone access to your app and you're delivering a service through that app. So given the fact that most health apps would probably be for personal use, not all apps in the health space are for personal use, because some of them could have a business use, but if they are for personal use, then they will definitely be bound by the consumer guarantees. And when it comes to services, the types of guarantees that are set out in the legislation include that the service will be provided with due care and skill, and that the service and any product resulting from that service will be fit for purpose. So what does that basically mean? It means then that the people who are using that app will have some rights. If you are in breach of those guarantees, so if you don't provide the service with due care and skill, or the app is not fit for purpose, then you can become liable. You can't contract out of those consumer guarantees. They're set in legislation. You can't contract out of it. And in the case of the guarantees for services that are for personal use, you can't limit your liability for those guarantees as well. So it's just something to bear in mind when you're designing apps or delivering apps. You need to think about, well, what are the terms on which we're providing this app for use? Usually there would be some kinds of terms and conditions that would go with that. Advertising, as I said before, that's just another area to bear in mind. Again, Australian consumer law is relevant here. It applies to advertising for any type of goods or service. And basically the general rule is that you can't advertise in a way that's false, misleading or deceptive. You should also make sure that any advertising is not offensive. You should make sure that information about the costs to buy the app or for continued use of the app are very clear. That sort of goes to whether or not the information you're providing is misleading or deceptive. Another area that may come up, particularly if the app is being provided by a health practitioner, might be around, maybe the health practitioner national law, where they have some regulations around advertising of services, of health services. And there's some restrictions on using testimonials, and also some extra restrictions around unreasonable expectation of the benefit of using the app or the treatment, and those sorts of things. I mentioned before the TGA. The TGA Therapeutic Goods Advertising Code will apply if your app is a medical device. And just to give you a sense of some of the extra things that you would need to be concerned about there in your advertising would be, you would need to just make sure that the advertising doesn't give the user an unrealistic expectation of the effectiveness of the app. That it won't lead the consumer or the patient to self-diagnose or to treat a serious condition. Some of the other things would be that advertising can't use language that would bring about fear or distress, or encourage inappropriate or excessive use. So there's a bunch of regulations in the TGA advertising code just about making sure that the promotional and advertising material that's used for medical devices, and if your app falls within that, your app, are regulated and appropriate for the consumers. Now you might be thinking, well, we're not necessarily going to go out and advertise a lot, but some things to bear in mind are that in the case of an app, the App Store description, the App Store category, information about the app on your website would all be considered to be promotional or advertising material. Obviously, media releases that you might issue, any quotes or user reviews. I mentioned before that there is a regulation under the health national law that if you're not covered by that, then you might have testimonials and that kind of thing, and you just need to be careful about the use of those. They will be considered to be advertising and promotion. Obviously, if there's external postings, I think Lois kind of touched on this a little bit in her presentation. If people are writing things, or you have chat rooms, or the ability for consumers to interact with you on the app, and that's visible to the public, then you obviously need to be careful about the comments that are being left on the app. And if people are putting up information that's incorrect, then you just got to make sure that you correct it, and make sure that you remove anything that might be offensive. As far as security, there is no specific law that app developers must follow, but there are a bunch of best practice and industry guidelines that are available and readily available on the internet. And also the Australian Information Commissioner has a guide about securing personal information. Obviously with security you should be thinking about taking a risk-based approach. One thing with health apps is that it's likely that you might be collecting, or well, if the health app is collecting a person's health information, then obviously health information is treated a bit more seriously under the Privacy Act and the privacy legislation. It's considered to be sensitive information, so you should make sure that the security that you develop around the collection of that information and the way that it's stored is a bit more robust than perhaps some of the other information. But like Lois said, privacy by design is something that a lot of the privacy regulators are talking about and trying to promote. So privacy and security is something that should be, front of mind when you're developing an app. Lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about ownership, because that's, it is another legal issue that comes up when people are developing apps. There is a common misconception that, just because I paid for it, that I own it. That's not necessarily the case. IP, basically the law is that IP that's created by an employee in the course of their employment is owned by the employer. If you engage a contractor, then the contractor will own that IP unless you get a written assignment of that IP to you or to the legal entity that you want to own it. I'm not sure whether most of the audience are people who are thinking that they're going to be developing apps within the course of their employment. Obviously if you are, well then that might be just part of your employment, and your employer will own the app that you create or the IP that surrounds that. It's possible that as part of that app development that you engage with external service providers, and you just need to think about what IP they might be bringing to the table. So obviously if you're engaging someone who's helping in coding the app, then you want to try and make sure that you get an assignment of the IP in that code. That being said, you do need to be aware of the fact that there is in app development there are different tools that are used. So some not all app developers will write the code from scratch. They use tools. I think Oliver was kind of referring to that in his presentation. So you kind of really need to understand and have a discussion with the developer about, well, what is it that they're actually creating? What tools are they using? Because it may be that you need some licenses and other things in order to use the app, once it's been developed. So anyway, look, obviously IP is very important from a commercialisation point of view. I understand that commercialisation is a topic that's going to be covered in workshop 2, and so that's probably a good segue for me to finish. So I'm not sure whether anyone has any questions about what I just skipped through really quickly. No?
Sorry, I have a question.
Yep.
Whilst you're talking to us in health, there are quite a lot of private people do have developed apps providing advice in regard to health. We work in child and family health, so providing advice on care and management of children.
Yep.
Are they subject to the TGA as well?
Well, some of that will just depend on whether, if the app falls within that.
Sorry, we'll just repeat the question for the people on live stream. So your question was around getting advice from people outside of health, so private developers, etc. Is that subject to the same TGA as something with inside health? Is that what your question was around?
No, it's around a private person, for example, writes a book on how to look after your child, right? And they develop an app from it. Are they subject to the TGA if they're providing advice on how to manage your child's behaviour or psychosocial problem?
Yeah. Okay. So yes. Sorry. Did you want to repeat that question?
I think the example that was provided was if somebody writes a book on how to manage your child, do they then need to comply with TGA when going through that process?
Okay. Right. So I think the answer to that will really just be, does the app fall within that definition of medical device? So if the app is something that will be used to diagnose or treat or alleviate a condition, then there's a good chance that it will fall within that definition and it will be caught by the TGA, which would mean, yes, they would need to comply with the TGA requirements as well. Yeah, so it doesn't matter who is developing the app, it's just more about, does the app fall within that definition? If it does, well then you need to comply. Yep.
Got one more question, just at the back of the room.
Just in regards to TGA approval for apps that do provide advice, so apps are often updated very frequently, so daily, weekly, whatever. Is it a requirement that TGA almost reviews each version of the app, or is it just once you got approval, that's it?
Okay, so I think the question's along the lines of, because apps are updated regularly, will the TGA review those apps as they're updated? Is that the question? Okay, so with the TGA, it'll be, in some ways, self-regulatory, in the sense that it's up to you, the app developer, to, if it falls within the definition, to ensure that the app is listed on the ARTG. If you don't do that, then you will be in breach. Now, the TGA might come and start looking at your app if it gets a complaint, perhaps from a competitor or from a consumer, and they will look at the app at that particular time and they'll assess it. And if it doesn't, if they feel that it falls within that definition, then they'll send you a letter, say, well, why haven't you listed it? And please explain. And you may incur a penalty as a result of that. So it's really up to you to make sure that when you're developing your app, you go through the right steps and either get it listed if you need to, or if you are updating the app and the update causes it to become a medical device, well then you probably shouldn't release the updated version until you are listed. Yeah. Otherwise you'll run the risk of maybe falling out. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, so just to be clear, the TGA doesn't actively look at these apps each time a new app is listed on the register, and they go, okay, this is what you're doing, this is the evidence for it, and then you release a slightly different feature, and they go, this is what you're doing.
Okay, so the question is, will the TGA actively look at apps once they're on the register, and if you update the app, will they look at it again? My understanding is no. I think they would look at it in the first place, make sure that it complies with the requirements, that you're complying with the essential principles and those other things that I mentioned, and then I just wouldn't think they would have the resources to continue to be looking at it. But if they get a complaint, they will. Yeah.
Well, please thank me and join me in thanking Michael for that very informative presentation. All right, lovely. So just before I welcome our next speaker, I recognise that we've all been sitting for a little while, so I was just going to encourage everyone just to move around in your seat, stand up, 30 seconds, turn around, chat to somebody you haven't met or don't know, and maybe share something that you've learned today. So those people on live stream, I'd suggest jumping up from the computer and doing a bit of a dance. We can't see you, so no worries about that. All right, I'll just indicate to bring everyone back together in another 30 seconds to a minute.
My wife was my guinea pig, and she was just happy with it. She was
All right, in the interest of time, we'll bring everyone back together for our final few speakers, and we can all get you out into the foyer for some refreshments. I'd welcome those people on the live stream to come back and join us, and those in the room will get started. So our next session is presented by Brett Avery from eHealth, and Brett's an experienced enterprise and solutions architect with a focus on delivering adaptive architectures, enabling enterprise agility and support of business transformation capabilities. His current role at eHealth New South Wales is the enterprise architect for data, focusing on architecting technology solutions that enable service capabilities in data management, information planning and design, analytic services that drive organisational value. So wonderful array of skills there, and Brett's here to talk to us today about the New South Wales health landscape, so please join me in welcoming Brett.
Thank you very much. I guess I was just saying to my colleague, I'm probably a little bit more corporatized than some of the other presentations you've done. I guess it's a reflection of my role within the organisation, within eHealth New South Wales, of being an enterprise architect and having an overarching view of exactly what our landscape looks like. So I hope this session is informative to everyone and gives you a bit of an idea about the complexity that does exist, but also the opportunities that exist with our environment as well. So if you have worked in New South Wales Health, or at least have a level of understanding of our environment, it is somewhat complex in terms of it's made up of a number of devolved organisations. As a result of the way the organisation is structured, our ICT environment is equally as complex. So while we have a number of state-based applications that have been developed and introduced in order to support cross-setting information sharing, we also have a number of domain-based core clinical and specialty functions that are somewhat aligned to the way our organisation is structured. And you'll see a little bit later as to why that adds complexity. So, as I mentioned, the objective of really this presentation is to provide you an understanding of what that environment looks like, so that when you are developing an app, you're doing so with the knowledge that if you want to support an enterprise-wide capability, then there are a number of factors that you need to take into consideration. So I really want to answer three key questions out of this presentation. Firstly, what does that ICT landscape look like? So I'll give you a bit of an indicative view of what that looks like. What are the opportunities that do exist? So what are the things you can leverage within our ICT environment that can actually help you as part of your app development? So, so you can leverage it and actually achieve the business outcomes that you're looking to achieve. And lastly, what are some of the additional design considerations that should be made in developing apps? Now, you've probably heard a number of those points already from previous speakers, so it will be no surprise that I'm covering a couple of additional topics. But hopefully I can talk through some of the implications that will actually, that you need to consider as part of the development. So what does the ICT landscape look like? Strangely enough, I didn't have a single slide or presentation or diagram to actually to describe what it looks like. So I had to start from scratch. Having worked within New South Wales Health for a number of years, I know what it looks like, but yet nobody's seen to have documented before. So what you see in front of you is, as I mentioned, some of the core applications that are really around clinical specialties, core applications that are broken into a series of domains. You can see that in the middle, which are based on organizational similarities. So what does that mean? What does organizational similarities mean? Well, we have broken the organization up into a series of organizations based on local health districts, specialty networks, and a number of other pillar organizations. When it comes to clinical functions, we have a number of groupings of clinical applications based on those organizational structures. So, a simple question. If we look at the storage on the right-hand side, and we look at all the types of data that we have, if I looked in sort of in the middle around electronic medical records, how many of those do we have? Well, the answer is tied with the number of domains. So we don't have one medical record for a patient. We have, in fact, 9. So already, if you're thinking about developing an app and you would like it to support a organization or a part of the organization that provides services to all our local health districts and all our hospitals, well, you have to be conscious of the fact that the data you may want to get access to and surf it in front of a user may be in 9 locations. 9 locations also means 9 levels of variation in the way that data is structured. So it becomes awfully complex at that point where you simply want to show in front of a user patient information. Well, there's a lot of hurdles that you need to overcome. It's not insurmountable. There's opportunities that do exist in order to help you achieve your outcomes, and I'll touch on those in some later slides. But maybe just sort of looking at sort of some of the core capabilities that do exist within our ICT landscape, we recognise that from an access point of view, there are different devices that we'd use. So we've heard a presentation around mobile devices. A lot of the applications that we have are delivered through desktop applications. There are multiple channels that you can take advantage of in order to access the information. We have a lot of integration capabilities that do allow you that capability of actually moving information between applications or getting access to information that is sitting within our core and specialty applications. We have made a significant investment when it comes to statewide integration and data sharing, particularly for supporting things like integrated care. We have capabilities around interoperability for patient registry, provider directory. They are available and can be utilised. We have a number of core state-based applications, such as our support at providing patient clinical history. So we've recognised some of the difficulties we're having within our landscape, and we've already created some applications that try and consolidate information for the purposes of information sharing. As I mentioned already, that the core clinical functions are largely based on these concepts of domains structured around our organisational similarities. Lastly, we have made significant investment when it comes to statewide infrastructure. So we do have solid foundations when it comes to being able to connect devices, to move information around, to provide information security. We have a number of capabilities there that we can leverage. If I was to do a little bit of a deep dive and to show more practically, I guess, the landscape that we're living in, thinking about those multiple domains based on a number of different systems, you can see, if I just focus purely on the core applications, that we have a number of vendors that will provide the same capabilities. So as an example, if we want to provide inpatient services and you would like to provide an electronic medical record or an EMR, we have 2 vendors playing in that space already. Not to mention we've got multiple instances of the same vendor, of the same product. If you wanted to support emergency department, again, we have at least 2 vendors. This is somewhat indicative, it's not exhaustive of what our vendor landscape looks like, but it's something that as an enterprise architect and the enterprise architecture practice within eHealth has to grapple with on a regular basis. We're always consistently looking around how do we provide a consolidated view of a patient's information, given the landscape that we have at the moment. What opportunities are there to consolidate as we move forward as an organisation? But with the complexity that does exist, there is some I guess, important capabilities that show that we're on a journey around standardisation within the organisation. So, for example, we do have a single best possible record of a patient's identity in our enterprise patient registry. So that's great. We actually understand. We have a central place that we can go to say we know the patients that have presented to any of our facilities or hospitals. We have a single provider directory of the clinicians who are providing care within New South Wales Health, so that's a benefit for us. We have an enterprise imaging repository, so any images, radiology images that are captured throughout the state from New South Wales Health radiology departments are consolidated into one single place. We have a clinical repository, a place that you can see summary information about a patient in one place. So we've got some consistency, but we've got a fair amount of variation as well. Maybe more onto more of the more interesting side of things. So now that you understand the complexity, there are still opportunities that do exist within our ICT environment for implementing apps. This slide is probably not dissimilar to some of the previous conversations or presentations that have been made today. I think that theme around fit-for-purpose apps, and I was encouraged by the common use of language of defining narrow-scoped apps which use personas and scenarios to support optimal workflows of few user types, I think is an important message to make. That at the moment, thinking about those the core clinical and specialty systems that we have in our environment, they are big behemoths of applications that have many features that are trying to support multiple user types within our environment. They aren't optimized, and that's where the opportunity lies. Smaller fit-for-purpose apps that have a narrow scope, that focus on user workflow, is where we see an advantage and an opportunity for New South Wales Health. Given that you now get a little bit of indication of what the ICT landscape looks like, there is a lot that can be leveraged in terms of providing or meeting some of the concerns which have been raised previously in regards to privacy, security, and also integration with our core applications. So we have capabilities to provide identity, access, and control management. So that's something that you can essentially leverage off and offload from an app and saying, I'm not going to build that. I'm going to leverage what we've already got in our environment, because we've already gone through the process of ensuring that it's providing the suitable level of security required for our environment. So leverage of what we have. The integration capabilities that we have are really key if you would like to be able to get access to our core information. One of the comments that was made previously, I think it was Tim, saying that we don't want a whole bunch of different siloed data lying around the place. We don't want to see patient information sitting within the context of an app. We want it within the context of a medical record, and hence there is great benefit from actually integrating with our core systems, being able to support user workflow, but with the idea that you're going to contribute that information back into the medical record, so there's a holistic view of a patient within one place. Mentioned before, we have a fairly consistent infrastructure within New South Wales Health, so take advantage of it and leverage of it, along with things such as service operations. Often that is somewhat overlooked. Looking at sort of the ICT, the app development lifecycle, we saw that it sort of ended off with realization or, I guess, operation. Well, for me, that's where the beginning really starts. You've now created an application, and assuming you've done so that will meet a business need, it will be adopted. So then you're already thinking about, well, how am I now going to provide that as a service? You are essentially providing a service at that point, and thus there's a level of expectation around the reliability of that service, and hence monitoring and diagnostics are key capabilities that we have capability within our ICT environment that you can leverage. So don't feel like you need to develop yourself. Focus on what is pertinent, which is more of the user experience, the user workflow, leverage of what we've got available in our environment. App design considerations. So what additional design considerations should be made when developing an app? I will brush over the topics that have already been discussed, but might linger on some that haven't. So we have already touched on the notion of access channels, particularly in terms of making sure that you can, that the app has it should be accessible through the widest number of different access channels for consumers and users. There's certainly an emphasis on channel independence that will give the broadest amount of options for people to be able to access your app. I guess there's an implication around trying to achieve that consideration, which is it should try and it should be designed to operate consistently across multiple delivery channels. But as we heard in one of the other presentations, is that should be a consideration anyway. Devices and channels will change over time. And so if your application has the flexibility to change while the delivery channels and devices change, then you have the best opportunity of being able to deliver a consistent service. Integration and interoperability. One thing I would mention is that app solutions should provide functional abilities that are interoperable, not that they integrate, but they're interoperable. And what do I mean by that? Is providing a seamless experience to users in the sharing of information. Providing a consistent experience for users is a key to providing interoperability. Often what we find is that human workflows will transition over multiple applications. And so to create a seamless experience for the user, you really need the ability to say that, well, I might be performing a function in one application, and then a secondary function in another application in order to deliver care. From a user point of view, it should be seamless. We have capabilities in terms of providing a single sign-on or a single sign-on type capability. So I've logged into one application, I can get access to functionality in another application. It's a seamless experience for me. I've stayed within a patient context. I haven't had to navigate into another system, find the patient again, bring up their information in order to continue to do my job. It's already there as part of the environment. And that's something that you should consider as a principle as part of application design. In terms of integration, I mentioned that we want to integrate to move information, and we want to move information really into some of those core informational systems that we have, such as our email systems. So integration is key, and I would certainly encourage any app development to look at the relevant information standards in terms of adopting that to improve to make the integration capability more simple. I'll call out there's a clear momentum in the healthcare industry around the concept of FHIR as a data exchange standard or information exchange standard. So that should be something you'd be looking at. But likewise, call on your friendly IT staff or your enterprise architect or architects, and we can certainly help guide people in terms of what are the relevant standards in integrating with any of our information systems. Data security, there's probably, we talked much about this, so maybe I will talk more about the implications. So where will you apply data security? Well, certainly strong data at rest and strong data encryption while data is in motion is key. So we talked a little bit about some of the technologies, HTTPS to secure data in motion, but essentially the principle is that you want to make sure that at all points data is secure, and you can do that by providing encryption at different points that a data will be sitting. From a more practical point of view, it's worth pointing out that New South Wales Health, operated under eHealth, provides what's known as the Privacy and Security Assessment Framework, or PSAF for short. I would encourage app developers to leverage this this tool and go on the journey of actually completing a PSAF. The advantage of that, as part of your journey in developing apps, is that it will help you identify any risk in your solution. So thinking that security is very much of a balance around the openness of data versus the confidentiality and the sensitivity of data is important that we identify the risks and think about risk mitigation processes to ensure the security of data. Data governance and management is probably something that is a little bit closer to my heart. We talked a little bit. We've talked about security. We've talked about sort of privacy, but from a data governance and management point of view, it's something that is often overlooked. And unfortunately, I've seen it time and time again that the management of data, once you've actually got operational service, is not something that people have considered. So local health districts and specialty health networks are accountable as data owners, custodians for the data that is collected, stored, shared, and managed within their environment. So if you develop an application, the application is then used by a local health district or a specialty health network. The data that is being collected and captured is the data custodians is those LHDs and specialty networks. So as a result of that, to provide appropriate data governance and data management, then you need to think about metadata. So how do you know the metadata should cover things such as the source of the data, when it was changed, created, updated. All these types of additional metadata needs to be as part of your app. Because if you don't have that stored or that available, then we can't apply effective data governance and management. The last slide is somewhat of a summary, I guess, of the journey I hope I've taken you on in terms of, well, from a consideration point of view, what does a software development lifecycle look like? I always come back to the very first point. What is the need? What is it? We've heard what is a business problem. I would say what is the understanding of the business needs and the expectations of your business stakeholders in regards to the application development. Is that clear? If it's not clear, go back and reconfirm what is the need, what is the driver for the development of an application. This is where, as an enterprise architect, I will pull up a lot of initiatives because that is not clear. I think as an organisation, we've done a lot better recently around making sure that we have business sponsorship for everything that we do. It is great to see and it's very much encouraged, but I will always come back to what is the need, because when I come to doing an architectural assessment of a design, I will be coming to see whether the technology solution meets the business need. So in the planning stage, definitely consider around how you can leverage the capabilities that are available already within New South Wales Health. Don't develop things that you know you can leverage. That is already there. In terms of building, I mentioned before, build fit-for-purpose apps, and I think that's been a fairly consistent message today around focusing on user workflow. By doing that, you will find that you will reduce complexity, you're faster to deliver, and it's easier to test, and it supports very much independent delivery. Don't build a behemoth app. In terms of deploying, as I mentioned, leverage off the runtime infrastructure that we have, and consider around what infrastructure we do have. By leveraging off that environment, you will actually naturally be able to meet other requirements for data, particularly in terms of data sovereignty. Where is the data living? We can guarantee that that information will be sitting within New South Wales Health. The backups of that information will be sitting within New South Wales, meeting some of the legislative requirements and policy requirements that exist. If you were to leverage off other environments and run in other environments, then you need to be asking those questions as to, well, where is that information actually being stored? Not only in runtime, but also when we think about backup. The last one is think about the service you're delivering. That's the end goal. You need to be thinking about how you're going to operate, maintain, and support the application. How is it going to be continually evolved? Once you implement a service and it's widely adopted, it has to evolve. Businesses evolve, businesses change, your applications need to change with it. And lastly, how do you govern and manage data is a key. And hopefully that's a lens that you can put on app development that perhaps you hadn't done before. The last message always is engage with your stakeholders. Engage with business sponsors, IT staff, and end users consistently during your journey of app development. And on that point of engaging with your ICT stakeholders, I will offer, I guess, the enterprise architecture team, which I'm a member of, is there as a source or a resource that you can leverage off in terms of understanding exactly how you could best deploy an app or how you can best build an application to meet your business needs. We can work with you. We're very much around fostering ideas and opportunities, and we're very much ensuring that it aligns to business needs and business drivers. That's one of the key things. I've left the contact details for the enterprise architecture practice that you can contact. We'd be more than happy to work with anybody, even to have a conversation around what you're trying to achieve, let you know what that landscape looks like. I've given hopefully a small indication of the complexity, but we can really dive down into very specifics with you to make you aware of some of the intricacies that do exist within our environment. So with that, open up to questions.
Thank you, Brad. Very informative, and some of those diagrams were great to see, and it just illustrates how complex the environment is that we work in. So were there any questions in the room? We'll take a question from the room if there is one. Have one at the back.
Okay. Sorry, in the bottom one of your slides, you mentioned platform service providers such as Azure and AWS.
Yes.
Does New South Wales Health actually host anything on those platforms at present? And does New South Wales Health have any agreement with those vendors?
Yes, we do. So one thing to note is for Azure and AWS, we have what's known as a tenancy. So it's an opportunity for us to extend our capabilities and to utilize some of the as-a-service offerings that exist within those environments. In terms of how you could utilize those, test environments, development environments are great examples of how to utilize that environment. Of course, when it comes to thinking about information classification, when it comes to production data or real data in the real life, there's extra dimensions that we need to consider around utilization of those services, such as public sentiment, and I think we've heard some comments around that today. So there are definitely opportunities to leverage it from the point of view from that app development lifecycle. But when it comes to actually deploying it as a production application, then we would look at having that internally, so that the data that is created and stored is sitting within our environment. And I think that's a reflection of New South Wales in terms of how we view data and the importance of the sensitivity and the security of that data.
Thank you very much. Right. So we're out of time for questions, but if you have anything that you wanted to follow up with Brad or the speakers, we've got some time shortly to do that. But I would like to welcome our next speaker. Nina is a qualified health information manager with varied experience across several hospitals in Victoria and New South Wales in records management, clinical coding, activity-based funding and Standard 14 accreditation. Nina is currently a clinical documentation specialist where she identifies opportunities for clinical activity recovery through development of learning resources and audit tools for JMOs and their supervisors. Nina's presentation today will explore clinical documentation as the clinical source of truth and covers important considerations in developing mobile health applications. Please join me in welcoming Nina to present.
Great. Hi everyone, I'm short. I'm Nina Rao. I help hospitals recover clinical activity by analysing medical records and filling in the gaps in clinical documentation, improving data integrity for funding, legal and quality purposes. Today I'm going to talk to you about a few key considerations regarding clinical documentation in mobile health apps. We'll cover what good clinical documentation achieves and design considerations in ensuring truthful and meaningful data and information being collected. I do warn you there's a fair bit of overlap, but depending on how positive you're feeling, it might show up as a really nice summary for today's talks. So, let's take out the context of mobile health apps and define what good clinical documentation does to support patient care. Firstly, produces reliable data. So how do we define reliable? If you follow the same navigation path or the same search criteria, does it give you consistent answers, or is it haphazard and ad hoc? In paper documentation, that would be ensured with a paper form, where we elicit the same kind of information over and over again by defining the fields required. So in the context of your mobile health app, are you using any data validation rules? Example, these can be when the fields are defined through character count, drop-down menus, radio buttons, like what you see in EMR. Reflecting the clinician's intent and clinical thought process. The reason why we call it clinical documentation is because you need to have a certain kind of qualification to do that documentation. So are you reflecting your training, your learning, your thought process? So in your mobile health app, are you reading patients' context, clinical cues, problems and goals, clinical actions and outcomes? Documentation structures such as ISPA and SOAP encourage documenting with clinical reasoning. Reflecting the complexity of diagnoses and work that clinicians do. Does documentation provide enough granularity in fleshing out the patient journey and following a particular clinical pathway? Number 4, being conclusive and complete. Does the documentation account for all issues or goals being addressed in the encounter, and does it provide closure by mentioning the outcome or further clinical actions required? In the context of mobile health apps, what are we trying to achieve? Generally, we're trying to augment clinical care by providing mobile and adaptable resources for patients, families, clinicians, and researchers. The provision of healthcare is no longer a passive process. Patients have greater agency and higher health literacy to empower them to drive their own treatment. What is your app designed to do? It's obviously a very important question because we've asked you this 10 times today. What is the scope of your app? What kind of audience are you trying to reach? Because the kind of language that you're going to use or the kind of classification you're going to use is going to vary between aged care, childhood and family services, acute services, etc. And on the note of what your app is designed to do, we'll broadly categorize into whether it's a reference-only app, that is, you're only putting in information. Is it a calculation app where you input data or text and it returns to you an answer? So that includes NPL or automation. And the third type is free text. So you're freestyling the documentation and you're trying to capture the nuances outside of classifications and categorizations. So what terminology or classification is being used? So everybody working in New South Wales Health will likely be already aware of your functional impairment measurement classifications, or your ASA scoring for anaesthetists, or if you're in stroke or rehabilitation, your Oxfordshire classifications. Where I come from, we use the ICD-10 classification. It was developed by the World Health Organization. It's used in over 100 countries, and it has something like 16,000 possible codes you could use in acute inpatient care. You also have SNOMED, which have something like 125,000 codes. Where are the data sets stored? So again, a very important question, especially in trying to decide what kind of language or classification that you're using. If you're going to use SNOMED, or if you're going to use drop-downs to select SNOMED codes, then you've got to provide 125,000 options, as opposed to 16,000 options from ICD-10, approximately 400 options for functional impairment measurement, etc. So you need to think about, if you're using a certain classification, how big is it and how are you going to store it? Who owns the data? So it depends on whether you're working in a private practice or whether you're working in, whether you're developing the app for New South Wales Health, or whether you're working for an NGO or a federally funded organisation. As Lois touched on, there are different privacy and ownership rules in regards to how that data is stored and who owns the data. How is the content made available for subpoena or legal matters? This is a really fun one because as wonderful as it is to have an intuitive user interface, the output needs to be intelligible, it needs to make the users accountable if they're clinicians using it, and it needs to be clear. All patient information in mobile health apps, especially if it's going to be integrated into the EMR, it needs to be traceable, and it needs to follow the same rules as the EMR for providing evidence in a law of court. How are the users made accountable for the data being input into the app? We've talked about privacy, we've talked about the ability to do things anonymously, and now I'm going to flip that on its head and say, if you are providing any patient information where you're making decisions around the well-being of somebody, you need to be accountable for it. This is the same in paper records, electronic records, and nothing changes when you're doing it on an app. I'm going to outline a brief case study to you. It's the Electronic Patient Administration System in South Australia, and I'm sorry if there's anyone from there here tonight. So Stephen Herzog suffered traumatic internal injuries from an oxygen tube being put in his catheter, resulting in his death. This became a coroner's case. The coroner did not feel the printouts of the record were intelligible, so they weren't really meaningful in trying to get to the bottom of the truth. The coroner was doubtful all authors were using their own logins, and whether we want to talk about it or not, I'm pretty sure most local health districts are facing this as well. None of the information was deemed credible or adequate to come to a conclusion, and not only that, in a further inquest, it was later found out that the patient had tendencies to play with their own medical equipment or anything like that, but that was through verbal confirmation. Nothing about that was written down, which obviously completely changes the conversation in a coroner's case. So the take-home is make sure your content can be reproduced in a readable format, including the ability to see who has authored what and at what time. So this is a quick table, which I thought was very complicated, but given what you've seen earlier, you can just take a picture of this and it's pretty easy to read. So in terms of reference only, clinical reasoning should be inbuilt into the app because you're referring to another credible source. In decision support, clinical reasoning is also inbuilt into that calculation. But if you're documenting yourself, then you're responsible for showing that clinical reasoning. The same with audit capabilities and traceability. That's only a really important factor in your own free text documentation or a combination of these. You must make sure that the data captured in your app is, surprise, surprise, owned, managed and stored securely by the appropriate entities. Attributed to the author and the date, time and designation is captured. And reproducible for court. And that's all I got. Thank you.
Nina, does anyone have any questions here or online? Fantastic. I'm just going to introduce the very last speaker, Karen, who is going to summarise for us today. So Karen Joyner is the Chief Operating Officer at Sydney Partnerships for Health Education, Research and Enterprise, or SPHERE. I'm going to do your full bio. No, okay, Karen's going to come and summarise.
I should have given you the shorter one. So needless to say, I'm the Chief Operating Officer for SPHERE, and SPHERE is an academic health science partnership. So we have 4 health services in our partnership, and in Sydney, Sydney Health Partners does northern, central and western, and we do central, southeastern and southwest as a population we capture. Unfortunately, we don't reach the Illawarra, but there is a Hunter New England one looking at rural, and there may be an opportunity for connection in that way. We're really proud to be sponsoring this today because we think this is really important, and we've heard lots and lots of stories about lots and lots of people wanting to design apps. We've heard lots and lots of stories from health managers tearing out their hair going, oh my God, not another app. I've heard lots of stories from New South Wales Health going, oh my God, not another 10 apps doing the same thing from 10 health services. So this initiative by this network was, I thought, a really great idea of just starting, there's a series of 3, starting with a 101 and working our way through it. So today I hope you've all heard the messages If you're employed by the health service and you're developing an app, it's the health service's app, not your app. You need to make sure that you've got integrity around the data, storage, traceability, and reproducible for court. All those really good legal elements. The regulatory framework, we've heard a little bit about that today, and I'm hoping that some of you have had an aha moment to think about, maybe I just really need to think again about what my app is, which really takes the most important part, which is, have you actually thought about your user cohort, the users who you want to use your app? You've heard the scenarios and the stories about people might download an app once and use it once, but if you're actually want them to keep engaging with it and use it and make it really viable for you on a long-term basis to have that engagement with your patient group, your carer group, the community, then that's really important. So I think we've heard some really interesting things, and I always love the IP element because, of course, New South Wales Health is just at the moment reviewing its 2004 policy on IP. And I think we might actually get to an end this time. We've reviewed this a few times in New South Wales and never quite got to an end and updated it, and it will incorporate digital health in some of these elements as well. So give us 12 months and you'll probably have a really nice new policy to help guide you with some of this as well. The really important part, of course, in the regulatory environment was the medical devices. That tricks a lot of people up because they don't necessarily think about their app when they want to develop it, about what it is you're really doing in your app, and therefore what frameworks do you really fall under, or legal elements do you really fall under. And for the question up the back about do you have to submit to TGA every time you change something? No, but trust me, they're on the hunt. And all you need is one complaint. Depending on the complaint, they will come and they will investigate. So they don't have the resources to do it all the time, but they absolutely are responsive these days. They used to never be responsive. Not so much these days. There's a lot more inquiry around what they're doing. So don't think you can sneak it past them. It's a good one to know. So I think I've covered off all of the key elements that were sort of talked at this workshop. It was meant to give you a 101 viewpoint and hopefully get you really thinking about whether the app that you're working on, whether you've thought about all the elements you really need to think about before you go the next step. I think many of you, or many of the people I've spoken to at least, are getting grants to progress their apps, and this then leads me into the sustainability point. A grant that gets you the app doesn't actually create the sustainability for your app. And I think it was fantastic we had some outside of health people here today to talk about and who really have had experience at developing apps for business purposes. So the next workshop is really one to you'll hear from some experts around sustainability, and I really implore you to come to that because more and more your leadership teams are going to be asking the economic question, why am I going to bother giving you money, giving you a grant, freeing up your time for you to spend developing an app if in fact that app isn't going to be worthwhile in 6 months' time? They're getting clued in now, and these are some of the thoughts they're having. So we really want you to have that plan in place, and then you can really build that into the way you want to implement your apps. So from my perspective, I'd like to thank everybody for coming along. And as I said, Sphere is very proud to support this initiative and to support the network and all of you who are really thinking about innovation and what you can do to step change our health system. It's really exciting. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. So just before we wrap up and head out for something to eat, I think Yanni and I would really like to acknowledge the presenters who have come today and dedicated their time not only to presenting today but putting together a presentation, meeting with us to talk about today's session, to submitting documentation to us, all out of kind of the generosity or the goodness of their heart. So we're very appreciative of that. We would like to also thank the network members for their promotion, and particularly those here at Sydney for helping us with the room. We'd like to say thank you to Lachey, who works with me in southeastern Sydney, for all of her coordination and support in pulling this event together, with over 230 people registered to join us today face-to-face and via live stream. It's no mean feat, especially on a budget of $0. So we've spent a lot of our evenings, weekends, lunch breaks, early mornings sorting out today. Thank you to all of you who have come all the way here today from near and far to be a part of this and to support this first workshop. As Karen mentioned, there are 2 more workshops running over the next couple of weeks, the next one on the 29th of November and our final one on the 7th of December. So there's a whole range of topics. We're just confirming the last couple of speakers for those, and we'll get those programs out to you in a similar fashion as we did for this session. We'd like to thank the team at Sphere for their sponsorship of this session, and thank you especially to the eHealth team who have provided us with a number of speakers today and have helped us with the live streaming of the event. So I think I will hand over to Gianni just for the last 2 points, but thank you again.
I was just going to say, Dan could say it. There's light refreshments and drinks out in the foyer, so please, if you can stay around, have a chat and hopefully network with some people, and we'll see you all on the 29th. Thanks.